In this section, we're going to be talking about our Spaceflight 365 data model, and specifically around data integration. We're going to look at the types of integration that we have open to us, and then we're going to move on to how we might implement each of those types of integration. And then we're going to specifically look at how we're implementing the Spaceflight 365 data in our solution. The question that I think you should always ask whenever you're embarking on data integration is, do you really need to have the data inside Dynamics CRM? Now, I often joke about the first rule of integration being don't integrate. But really, it's more about saying, well, there are so many different options that we have open to us. If we have data inside Dynamics CRM, it's always going to cost more than we might anticipate. The total cost of ownership is large because, as well as handling the actual integration, you also have to handle the management of failures. You have to understand whether or not the data is going to be updated in multiple places and handle race conditions. And then also you've got to pay for that storage in Dynamics CRM, especially if it's an online environment. So in order to answer these questions about does it need to be there, we need to look at, well, who is it going to be using this data and how and when they're going to use it? Because we don't necessarily need to take all of the data. We could have a transactional system that we aggregate and bring in just those aggregate sums or averages against the data that we have in Dynamics CRM and then show that in dashboards. We may also only take in a very small subset of data. So if we've got customer data existing in two different places, and understanding, well, what do we need to bring in? And then can it be updated? And say, for example, someone's updating the address on the phone to a customer. Well, we may not need to update that data directly. We may just take the data from the customer and then push that into the other system. And then we can also look at, well, what opportunities do we have to aggregate data outside of Dynamics? So, for example, Power BI allows us to pull data from two different data sources and integrate them together. So if we look at a data flow diagram of all of our different data sources, we can start to draw the logical flow. So this is nothing to do with the implementation. This is purely about saying there is some data that exists in our flight telemetry system that shows the longitude, latitude, altitude, speed of our different spacecraft, and that data needs to be consumed in Spaceflight 365 so that we can show the current location. And then equally, we've got an exchange rate service which has got data about the exchange rates of the different currencies, and then we've got data that exists in our spaceport web services that is information about the scheduled flights, if they're on time, about gates, etc., that needs to be consumed. But also we need to provide data back to the spaceport web services to say when somebody's been checked in, so security can use it. So this logical data flow has no information about whether or not it's going to be pushed or pulled, about race conditions, about how it's going to be monitored, if it's asynchronous or synchronous. There's so many different questions that come from looking at this logical data flow. And there's whole books that can be written on the topic of data integration. But I'm just going to give you some very straightforward steps to enable you to answer these questions. And the first one is to truly understand your data source. Define whether or not the data can be aggregated when it needs to be used. Is it transactional data that can be archived off after a certain point of time? Is it data that can be updated in multiple places? Or is it just simply reference data that just doesn't get updated very often? And if you don't understand the data, then the next steps really are going to be very difficult. So defining your user stories on how it's going to be used and by who and by when is always the first step. And then after you've understood your data, by looking at when that data is going to be integrated will allow you then to define what kind of technology solution you need. So identifying the triggering event that will cause this integration. So for example, if you have got data that's changing very quickly and needs to be read by the Spaceflight 365 in the case of our spacecraft telemetry, that would mean that there could be literally millions of update events every second. Whereas something like our check-in, where we need to know almost immediately when somebody's checked in, but it doesn't actually happen very frequently, again, that will influence the way in which we integrate and we define our solution. And so once you've got a feel for how and often you need to and what the events that are going to trigger, you can then start to identify the interfaces. And so specifically, those interfaces may be already existing. So in the case of our spaceport services, they may be a third party that gives us those interfaces. But in other times, there may be interfaces that we actually have to provide so that third parties can integrate with us. And the interface starts to form the kind of the contract. It's the demarcation line between our external systems and our internal. And this is really one of the key goals to understanding our solution architecture. And it's being able to define a boundary around what is our system and what exists outside of our system. And that boundary is going to be our concern primarily when we're talking about integration. We don't really need to worry about anything that happens outside that boundary as long as we understand the interfaces that we have available to us and the contract that exists around that in terms of its availability, how often we can call it, is there any charge that's involved, etc. And then the next step is to understand what kind of authorization and authentication happens on that boundary, because some of those services are going to be open to anybody publicly, but some of them are going to be very, very strictly controlled using some access token or username and password. And not only is that when we are calling external services, also when people are calling our services. So it's a very important step to consider. And then, of course, the data mapping. So when we have got a schema difference, we need to understand, well, is it a one-to-one mapping? Is it a one-to-many? Is there certain fields that need to be concatenated? Does the data flow in both directions? Because if the data does flow in both directions, then mapping is going to make sure that you have to manage mapping both in and outbound without any changes to your data. And then what happens if your data integration fails? Who needs to be notified? Does it need to happen immediately? What's the impact of that failure? Is someone going to not get paid, or is there going to be some safety concern if that fails? Or is it something that actually can be handled in a much more looser manual monitoring kind of mode? So, and that leads us on to, well, what kind of monitoring do we need to have in place? Do we need to have something that's sitting there constantly telling us whether or not it's working, any kind of reconciliation? Because of course, for transactions like bank transactions, we want to really make sure that we reconcile. So maybe at the end of the day, we have a totaling up of all the transactions to make sure one side matches the other side, because the implications of that not working is not going to be good. And so once we've got all of these pieces in place of the jigsaw, we can then really define the design of our integration.